Japan has 8 million abandoned homes. Inside one of them, a family's journals describe something coming down from the mountain, and then the entries just stop. In 2023, a photographer walked into a house in rural Tokushima Prefecture that had been sealed shut for nearly 40 years. The door hadn't been forced. The windows hadn't been broken. Whatever closed this house did so from the inside. And when he stepped through the threshold, he found a home frozen in 1985. Bowls of rice on the table, long since petrified into calcium white stones. Clothes hanging in the closet, still folded on their wire hangers. Family photographs on every surface, a mother, a father, 2 children smiling in that restrained, dignified way common to rural Japanese portraits of the era. Shoes lined up neatly at the gen-can. A television set still plugged into the wall. And on a low wooden desk near the back room, a stack of handwritten journals spanning several years, the final entries of which described something the family referred to only as Yama Kara no Reihausha, the visitor from the mountain. The family's fate remains entirely unknown. Municipal tax records show that payments simply ceased in 1985. No death certificates were ever filed. No relocation documents exist. The family did not move. They did not die, at least not in any way the Japanese bureaucratic system acknowledges. They were simply there one day, and then they were not. And the house waited, sealed and silent, for 38 years until a stranger opened the door and found their story still sitting on a desk, begging to be read. To understand what happened here, you first have to understand what an ikiya is and why Japan has 8 million of them. The word translates simply to empty house, but the reality is far more complex. Japan's population has been declining for decades. Rural communities that once thrived around farming, fishing, and forestry have been slowly hollowing out as younger generations migrate to Tokyo, Osaka, and other urban centers. The homes they leave behind don't get demolished. They don't get sold. In many cases, they can't be. Japanese inheritance law and cultural attitudes toward properties where misfortune occurred create a kind of legal and spiritual limbo. These houses simply sit, decade after decade, slowly being consumed by vegetation and weather and time. Some estimates suggest that by 2033, nearly a third of all homes in Japan will be vacant. Entire villages exist now where every single structure is abandoned. And within this vast, silent architecture of emptiness, there are houses like the one in Tokushima, homes that weren't gradually abandoned but abruptly sealed, as though the occupants left in the middle of an ordinary evening and never came back. The photographer, who has asked to remain anonymous but shared his documentation through a popular Japanese urbex community, described the experience of entering the Tokushima house as deeply unsettling in a way he struggled to articulate. He had explored dozens of ikiya before. He'd seen decay, collapse, personal belongings left behind. But this house was different. The preservation was almost aggressive, as though the house itself had refused to let go. Mold had claimed some surfaces, yes. Insects had done their work in the kitchen. But the bones of the home were intact. The structure was sound. And the personal effects weren't scattered or disturbed, they were arranged. Deliberately. As though someone had tidied up before the end. The journals were the last thing he found, and the first thing that made him contact others. There were 5 journals in total, written in a tight, meticulous hand that researchers believe belonged to the father. They span from approximately 1981 to mid-1985. The early entries are mundane: crop yields, weather patterns, notes about the children's schoolwork, a running tally of household expenses. The kind of quotidian record-keeping common in rural Japanese households of the era. But beginning in late 1983, the tone shifts. There are 5 specific things documented in those journals that no one has been able to satisfactorily explain. The first is the sounds. Beginning in November of 1983, the father begins noting strange noises coming from the mountain behind the property. Not animal sounds. He was a lifelong resident of the area and knew the local wildlife intimately. He describes them as rhythmic, almost deliberate, like someone striking wood against wood at irregular intervals. Always at night. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. He writes that his wife heard them too. The children slept through them, at first. The second is the footprints. In January of 1984, after a rare heavy snowfall, the father documented a set of tracks that descended from the mountain, circled the house 3 times, and then returned uphill. He described them as barefoot, human in shape, but disproportionately long and narrow. He measured them with a carpenter's rule. 38 centimeters, nearly 15 inches. He notes that no one in the village claimed responsibility and that the tracks did not match any known animal. The third is what he called the watching. By spring of 1984, the father writes that the family had begun to feel observed. Not in a vague, anxious sense, in a specific, directional sense. He describes moments when all 4 family members would simultaneously turn toward the same window, toward the same point on the mountain, gripped by the shared conviction that something was looking back. He writes about this with remarkable analytical detachment, as though documenting symptoms of an illness. He notes the dates, the times, the duration. He was trying to find a pattern. The fourth is the gifts. Beginning in summer of 1984, small objects began appearing on the family's doorstep overnight. Stones arranged in neat rows. Bundles of mountain grass tied with what appeared to be human hair. A small wooden figure carved to resemble, and this is where the father's handwriting becomes notably less steady, something with too many limbs. He kept these objects. The photographer found them in a box under the desk, exactly where the journal said they would be. The carved figure was there. It is, by every account of those who have seen photographs of it, profoundly disturbing, not because it is grotesque, but because it is almost familiar, as though it represents something your mind recognizes but refuses to name. The fifth, and final documented phenomenon, is the visitor itself. In the later entries, spanning from late 1984 to mid-1985, the father writes about direct encounters. Not confrontations, encounters. He describes waking at night to find a figure standing at the tree line, perfectly still, facing the house. Always the same spot. Always the same posture. He describes it as tall, thin, and wrong, that is the word he uses repeatedly, wrong. Not in the way a person can look wrong, but in the way a sound can be wrong, or a smell. A fundamental incorrectness that registered not in his eyes but somewhere deeper. He writes that the figure never approached while being watched. But each morning, the footprints would be closer. 3 neighbors in the small community were later contacted during a 2023 follow-up investigation by a regional historical society. All 3, now elderly, said essentially the same thing. The family had become withdrawn in their final year. The father had stopped attending community events. The mother had pulled the children from school. One neighbor said the father had come to him in early 1985 and asked, very calmly, whether his family had ever seen anything on the mountain. The neighbor said no. The father nodded, thanked him, and never spoke to him again. The final journal entry is dated June 14, 1985. It is shorter than the others. The handwriting is controlled, but the strokes are heavier, pressed harder into the paper. The father writes that the visitor came to the house the previous night. Not to the tree line. Not to the doorstep. To the house. He writes that he could hear it moving along the exterior walls, slowly, as though feeling its way. He writes that it stopped at each window. He writes that the children were awake and silent in a way that children should never be silent. He writes a single line that has since circulated widely in Japanese internet communities dedicated to the paranormal: "It knows we are here. I think it has always known. I think it was waiting for us to know it." And then nothing. No more entries. No more records. The family simply ends. The house was sealed, from inside, remember, and for 38 years, it sat there on the edge of a mountain in Tokushima, keeping its secrets in the dark. Now, there are rational frameworks for interpreting this. Shared psychosis, folie à famille, is a documented phenomenon in which delusional beliefs transmit between closely bonded family members, particularly in isolated environments. Rural Japan in the 1980s, especially in remote Shikoku communities, could be profoundly isolating. The father's journal entries, for all their meticulous detail, could represent the careful documentation of a mind unraveling slowly and methodically, bringing his family with him. The sounds could have been wildlife. The footprints could have been a neighbor's prank or a misidentification. The feeling of being watched is one of the most common anxiety symptoms in existence. But this framework doesn't explain the disappearance. It doesn't explain why no bodies were ever found. It doesn't explain why the house was sealed from inside with no one inside it. It doesn't explain why municipal authorities, when contacted in 2023, had no records whatsoever, no inquiry, no missing persons report, no welfare check. In a country with one of the most meticulous bureaucratic systems on earth, this family fell through every single crack simultaneously. And it doesn't explain the carved figure. Multiple researchers who examined photographs of the wooden object found in the box noted its resemblance to imagery associated with a very specific and very old folk tradition in the mountains of Shikoku, one that predates Buddhism, predates Shinto as we understand it, and exists only in fragments of oral history passed down through communities that are themselves now vanishing. The tradition speaks of things that live inside mountains. Not on them. Not near them. Inside. Things that were here before people and that tolerate human presence only to a point. Things that occasionally, for reasons no story fully explains, choose a family. Watch them. Court them. And eventually, take them. The name used in these traditions varies by village. But the most common translation, across all variants, is the same. The visitor from the mountain. That house is still standing. The journals are now in the possession of the Regional Historical Society. The carved figure has been photographed but not yet formally analyzed. The family, mother, father, 2 children, remain missing. Not dead. Not relocated. Missing. For 38 years and counting. 8 million homes sit empty across Japan. Most of them are just houses. But some of them are sealed. Some of them have meals still on the table. And some of them have stories written inside them that stop mid-sentence, as though the author was interrupted by something they had spent years dreading and could no longer outrun. What do you think really happened to that family in Tokushima? Did isolation and paranoia drive them to vanish on their own? Or was there something on that mountain that the modern world has simply forgotten how to see? Leave your theory below.